this lesson, we'll be talking about the different types of I/O, input and output, and how to redirect that I/O. There are three default types of input and output. They are standard input, standard output, and standard error. By default, standard input comes from the keyboard, and standard output and standard error are displayed to the screen. Each one of these I/O types is given a file descriptor. File descriptors are just numbers that represent open files. For us humans, it's easier to reference files by name, but it's easier for computers to reference them by number. You might be thinking, my keyboard isn't a file, nor is my screen. On one level, that's true, but on another level, it's not. Linux represents practically everything as a file. This abstraction allows you to do some powerful things like take the standard output of one command that would normally be displayed to your screen and use it as the input to another command, or even redirect that output to a file. Use the greater than sign to redirect output and the less than sign to redirect input. The greater than sign redirects output from a command to a file, while the less than sign redirects input from a file to a command. The explicit way of using redirection is to provide a file descriptor number. However, if one is omitted, then the file descriptor 0 is assumed for input and 1 for output redirection. When you use two greater than signs, the redirected output will append to the file. Normally with redirection, a file follows the redirection operator. If you want to use a file descriptor instead of a file name, use the ampersand symbol. So instead of redirecting standard error to a file with 2 greater than out.err, for instance, you could redirect it to standard output with 2 greater than ampersand 1. This effectively combines standard error and standard output. If you want to ignore output, you can send it to the null device, which is dev null. The null device is a special file that throws away whatever is fed to it. You may hear people refer to this as a bit bucket. If you don't want to see errors on your screen and you don't want to save them to a file, you can redirect them to dev null, for instance. Let's look at the output of the ls-l command. Let's redirect that standard output to a file. Use the greater than symbol and follow it with a file name. Let's use files.txt. So if we look at the contents of files.txt, we'll see that it has the output of ls-l. You can append to an existing file with two greater than symbols. So let's take the standard output of ls and append it to files.txt. We can see that this is the ls-l output from earlier, and then at the bottom is just the ls output. Input redirection works like this. Let's take files.txt and redirect the contents into sort. And you see that sort was run on the command. This is really equivalent to sort files.txt, but this is another way to do it. File descriptor 1 is assumed for output redirection, while file descriptor 2 is assumed for error redirection. So this is the same, ls-l to files.txt is the same as ls-l1, the file descriptor number, to files.txt. However, make sure you don't leave a space if you're going to use this. Input and output redirection can be combined, so let's use files.txt as the input for sort command, and let's redirect that output to sorted files.txt. And you can see that that worked. When a program encounters an error, it reports its findings on standard error. File descriptor 1 is for standard output, while 2 is for standard error. File descriptor 1 is the default descriptor for output redirection. So this can mean that not all of the output generated by a program is captured by default. Let's look at this example. You can see that this ls command found files.txt, but it also had an error. The file not here was not there. Let's run the same command again. So in this situation, file descriptor 1, standard out, was redirected to the file called out. Standard error was not redirected, so it was displayed to our screen. You can see that standard out did go to out. Let's redirect standard error into out.err. So standard output came to our screen, standard error went to this file. This can actually be handy because you can send standard output one place and standard error to another. So let's do that. That's standard out, and this is standard error. And you could use that for an error log, for instance. You can also combine standard output and standard error. Let's do that. Redirect output to out.both. Take standard error and append it to standard output. So both the error message, no such file or directory, and the standard output of files.txt ended up in out.both. Let's use the null device. If you want to ignore errors, you can send the errors to dev null, or send standard output to dev null. And then now you just get the error message, or you can do both. Redirect output to dev null, append standard error to standard output. This lesson covered standard input, standard output, and standard error.